Okay, I'm showing a slide. Does that show?
I see it in your little corner. Is that what you're wanting?
No, I wanted it to be whole screen.
Okay.
Oh, hang on. I'll do a share screen.
Perfect. Yep.
Okay.
Excellent.
Excellent, the whole thing?
It looks perfect.
Yeah, I was worried about the aspect ratio.
Nope. It's good.
Okay. I got a new 4K screen and I found out that Windows 10 has difficulty scaling things on it, so it converts circles into ovals.
Huh.
Yeah. I had to invoke some black magic to make it look okay. Now, I'll stop screen sharing for the minute so that people can see me.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
Perfect. Yeah. Oh, stop share. Okay.
We'll give people a couple minutes to come. There's 1 minute till it starts, and then we'll give them, a minute.
Yeah. With this background of mine, I feel like I'm hanging out in the void from The Good Place.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I expect Janet to walk through any minute.
I should just change my name and I'll be Janet.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Oh, hang on, let me try an experiment. I'm going to wave something. Yeah, that's what I thought. It turns it into the background unless you keep the damn thing moving. Great. Last time I did this a couple of years ago, I couldn't turn the heating on because a possum had got in my house and was cowering behind my microwave. So I had to keep the back door open and hope that it left of its own accord.
Oh my gosh, that's terrible. Hopefully nothing so dramatic happens this time.
No, I've shut the cat door this time.
Right. So, shall I get us started?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Tingsalovola, and I'll be running the tech side of this presentation. You probably all know how it works by now, but a quick review before we get started. Tell me if you have any tech problems using the chat. There will be 20 minutes or so of presentation, 20 of Q&A. We end at 40 minutes sharp. Keep everything family friendly, keep it simple. And when it comes to time to ask questions, you can either do that by raising your hand, in which case I will call on you and you can ask on video, or do what people have been doing for the rest of today, which has been to just enter it in the chat and I will read it out. Don't use the Q&A tab, just to keep things simple. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Garry Stevens of the History in the Bible podcast.
Hello, people. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good generic time of the day. Here it's 5 o'clock in the morning in the middle of bloody winter and I'm freezing. But that's the price we pay to talk of these things. How are we all doing? Now, let me introduce myself. For the past 6 or 7 years, I've run a podcast called The History in the Bible. Now, like many podcasters, I am not an expert in the field. I have a couple of degrees, none of which is in biblical studies. I don't speak Latin or Greek or Hebrew. That hasn't stopped me before and it'll never stop me in future. In this particular show, I want to talk about one of the murkiest periods in the history of both Judaism and Christianity, the 2nd century, when Judaism remade itself and Christianity was invented. Now, No, I see. Before I continue, the tagline of my show is all the history in all the books in all the Bibles. For those of you who are Protestants or Jews, you might be surprised to find out that there are a lot more books in other people's Bibles than in yours. In this little table, we have traditional Catholic and modern Catholic names, books used by the Orthodox churches, and books used by that wackiest of churches, the Ethiopian Orthodox. Now, I'd like to point out that until the late 19th century, the King James Bible included all those Catholic books you see in green on the screen. It's only Martin Luther who decided to kick them out, and even that was contested for a while. I mean, Martin Luther wanted to kick out Revelation, but that, as you know, was retained. Now, let's take a look at the evidence we use to investigate biblical history. One thing, a red letter thing, unfortunately, there is an awful lot of fraud, forgery, and outright theft. I'll give you an example. One of the leading figures in the United Kingdom at a major collection at the University of Oxford has been accused of purloining a lot of that collection, hiding the fact that manuscript fragments were stolen, and making a mozza out of it. This investigation is ongoing. There's the famous case of the Museum of the Bible case, where it turned out a lot of its stuff had been either stolen or was outright faked. This is endemic, well, I suppose, to any problem in ancient history, but particularly to biblical studies. Now, what sort of evidence do we use to find out what's happened in the Bible? Literary sources are the best. Literally, historians writing things at the time. Now, one of our best sources for the period of the first century from ancient Israel is the historian Josephus. Unfortunately, he dies round about the year 100, and we lose that sort of evidence. Now, new discoveries, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are literary sources, are really very, very rare. One of the important things about the Dead Sea Scrolls was that there were so many of them, and they were so very old, regardless of their actual content. Sometimes we find a new single document or book, but to find something as big as the Dead Sea Scrolls, very rare. The next source we use is epigraphy, which is writing on stone or metal. Now, we uncover these things all the time, but they're mainly sort of funerary inscriptions and laws and lists, and they're often very difficult to read and interpret. The next sort of category we're looking at is short texts on papyri and parchment. Now, unfortunately, papyri, which is a paper product, are mainly preserved in ancient Egypt, which had an ideal climate for it, and they're quite rare elsewhere. Also, they tend to be little fragments. You might have something which was a large sheet of paper to start off with, but it gets chopped up into little fragments, usually the size of a credit card, and these have to be put together. Finally, archaeology. The good thing about archaeology is that new stuff is dug up all the time. Unfortunately, it's only able to answer specific questions. But the good thing about archaeology is the more you discover, the more it illuminates things. Now, let me give some examples. Here is a really good epigraphic inscription. It's in Greek. As you can see, it's relating to a Jewish family. Unfortunately, I forgot to write down what it actually says in ancient Greek. Now, this is an incredibly well-preserved prescription. Both you and I can read it, and if either of us knew ancient Greek, there'd be no problem in understanding it. Now, a more typical inscription looks like this. For example, that blue rectangle shows et duo rebetes, but if you look at et duo, the word breaks are odd. One of the things about ancient Latin and Greek is that very often there are no word breaks. The words just run into each other. In this inscription, it's really handy that the author has often put in little dots between words, but sometimes he forgets to put in a dot or he forgets to put in a space. But having dots and spaces between words isn't that common. Now, one nice thing about ancient Hebrew texts is that Hebrew very early and very sensibly decided to put in spaces or dots between words all the time. And that's enormously useful. Now, looking at this epigraphic inscription, can you imagine if this thing had been cracked, massively cracked, as most of them are, and you've lost letters, you've lost maybe whole words? You need a specialist to actually interpret this thing and find out what it's saying. And unfortunately, there's only so many people who can do that on the whole planet. Now, here are some of the things from archaeology, which have been incredibly exciting finds. This is a mosaic from a synagogue floor. Now, what's odd about it? It's got a zodiac. It has a zodiac. Pagan symbols. In the middle is Zeus Helios driving his four-horsed sun chariot. And you can see the symbols around the edge. I mean, a lot of these things, there's a lion which looks more like a cat. There are the Gemini, the twins. So we pretty much use the Roman zodiac. But this was found in a Jewish synagogue. No one had ever thought that we'd find pagan symbols in a Roman Jewish synagogue. Or take a look at this synagogue mosaic. Now, this looks like it's the story of Jonah. I mean, fish only really prominently feature in one single Old Testament stories. But take a look at those little figures at the top. They are Greek harpies. Again, pagan symbols. And we have found a lot of these synagogue mosaics which are full of pagan symbols. Now, have we found just one floor mosaic with pagan symbols? You go, okay, maybe a bit of an oddball architect just decided to do it. But here's an example of the network effects. If you find more and more of these things, now you're not just explaining one oddball architect. You have to explain why these things are very common. Let's take a look at the geography of the Roman Levant from the time of the Great Revolt in 66 to the year 200. As I'll show you in a second, the Great Revolt in 66 was absolutely pivotal. This was a rebellion, a Jewish rebellion, which ended up in a complete catastrophe. The temple against the Romans. The temple was destroyed and the very heart of Jewish life was split apart. Now, in this geography, at the very top, we have the province of Syria, then the little region of Galilee, Samaria, then Judea, then Idumea. Now, Galilee was full of Galileans who were looked down upon by the Jews that lived in Judea. The Galileans were regarded with suspicion. And remember, Galilee is where Jesus came from. And in fact, the little territory of Galilee used to belong to the old kingdom of Israel, which had been crushed by the Assyrians. So a lot of Jews were sort of, we're not quite sure about these guys. Next, the area of Samaria. Now, the Samaritans are distinct from Jews in their beliefs, and they had their own temple. And in general, they didn't get on with the Judeans at all. I mean, there's a good reason why the story of the Good Samaritan exists. Then, of course, you have the heart of Judea itself, which is, of course, Judea. Underneath that, the little area called Idumea, which had been conquered by the Judeans about 150 years before. To the east, you can see there are grey circles, Trachonitis, Decapolis, and Perea. These were largely pagan areas. The Decapolis in particular was full of Greek cities. So this is the political geography of the time. Now, a lot of these people really hate each other. The Greeks in Decapolis don't get on with anyone else. The Samaritans don't get on with anyone. And down south, there's a lot of Arabs who don't get along with anyone. In fact, no one, it's like the Balkans today. No one gets on with anyone else for indeterminate reasons. Second Temple Judaism. The Second Temple was founded after the Jews returned from Babylon. Now, really, we should call it the Second Temple. because this temple, the one that you see here in this model, was built by King Herod the Great. And it took about 50 or 60 years. It wasn't finished until well after Herod died. Now, the size of this thing is astonishing. Take a look at that little circle thing to the left-hand side. That is a theatre, a 3 or 4 story theatre. All those towers you see in the front are 1, 2, or 3 stories. The temple complex that you see there was in fact the largest structure in the Roman Empire until the Emperor Vespasian built the Colosseum. The actual holy place in the temple is that tall rectangular building towards the left-hand side. The rest of the temple is a vast court because the temple was not only a holy place, it was also the center of Judea's political life, its religious life, and its social life. The temple was a bank. It was a house of records. It was a city hall. It was the heart of everything. And it was run by, a priestly establishment who, had their mitts in everything. They were a political class as much as priestly. Oh, by the way, that Antonia fortress to the side there, that was built by Herod the Great as a fortress to protect the temple complex. Now, the temple establishment wasn't popular with everyone. People like the Essenes, for example, thought they were irredeemably corrupt. Well, just like anyone would think that a political class is irredeemably corrupt. Of course, there's going to be people who think that. But one thing the temple establishment did let happen was the creation of a huge variety of religious beliefs. They made no attempt to enforce uniformity or to enforce belief, and then they let a huge amount of literature flourish. Now, before we get to that, the little area of Judea was forged in a conflict region between two mighty kingdoms. After Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, it was divided into a whole bunch of areas. In Egypt, the Ptolemies set up the Ptolemaic kingdom. In Syria, all the way to India, the Seleucids set up the Seleucid Empire. Now, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids were forever fighting over that circled region. Guess where Judea is? So Judea, as it had been for so many centuries, was stuck between two major powers who every so often ran over it in an attempt to get control of it from the other side. Now, when the Judeans were under the Ptolemies, everything was swimming. Absolutely great. They loved being under the Ptolemies. Okay, maybe they weren't independent, but the Ptolemies were lenient and tolerant overlords. As it turned out, the Seleucids would not be. They'd be right bastards, actually. But let's take a look at this guy. King Seleucus I, the first leader of the Seleucid Empire. Now, Seleucus I, for whatever other things he did something absolutely remarkable for the time. It's so remarkable that to us, it is completely obvious. He invented linear time. He said that, okay, the first year of my empire is year 1, and that's it. It'll then march to 2, 3, 4, 5. That was revolutionary. That was absolutely revolutionary. Now, before that, you could only specify dates by saying something like, in the second year of Woodrow Wilson of the United States of America, the 4th year of King George V of Britain, the 26th year of Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, the 18th year of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Now, what year was that? We know it as 1914. It's a lot easier to think of it as 1914 than to have to use all these concurrencies. And of course, second year of Woodrow Wilson means when there's a new president, we're going to start back at 1 again. Same with all these other kings and rulers. You start at 1 whenever a new ruler comes along. Seleucus said, no, we're going to start at 1 and just keep going forever. And his dating system was used right until the early Middle Ages. Now, one of the things about this dating system is that for the first time, this linear system allowed people to conceive that there might be an end of time, that the world might end. That had never really occurred to anyone before. The Greeks, Aristotle, for example, believed that the world was eternal. It had always been here, and it always would be here. Think of the daily routines of just common life. They run in cycles. There's the cycle of the week, the month, and the year. And they just cycle and cycle and cycle and cycle. There's no reason to think that the cycles will end. They'll just keep on going. But Seleucus said, no, there's a linear thing. And if maybe one day the numbers will end. That sort of notion was taken up by a large number of apocalyptic groups in the Second Temple period. And there were lots of these people. They came to believe that the world would eventually end with God's intervention. Now, the granddaddy of all these books of apocalypses is called the Book of Enoch. Here is an example of the book in the Ethiopian liturgical language, Ge'ez. And this is the only language in which we have preserved copies of the entire book. We have found copies in Greek, I think Latin, and other languages. Now, until the 20th century, most scholars thought that the Book of Enoch was some sort of weird Christian parody of Jewish thought. This is weird. Then we found fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that immediately said, no, this is a very old, thoroughly Jewish book. The oldest portion of this book dates back to the time when Judea was under the Seleucid kingdoms. Now, this book is the very first document in Hebrew, well, originally in Hebrew, to propose fallen angels. There are no fallen angels in the Old Testament. There is no Satan in the Old Testament. Ooh, let me correct myself. There is a character called Hasatan, which means the adversary. But in the Old Testament, Hasatan is not a bad dude. In fact, he's God's best buddy. It is the Book of Enoch which invents the concept that Hasatan and other angels are fallen and they're evil in some sense, and that they wage a war both in heaven and on earth against God. And the apocalypticists, which is a very hard word to say, have determined that the end of the world could come at any moment. God will triumph over the bad people and the bad angels and will set up a perfect earthly kingdom. Now, a note, if you've seen the movie Noah with Russell Crowe, where everyone dresses in sort of Bronze Age chic, Enoch is Methuselah's father. Methuselah, played by Anthony Hopkins in the film, is actually given a lot of the characteristics of Enoch, because no one knows Enoch. Everyone's heard of Methuselah. And Methuselah is, Enoch is Noah's great-grandfather. And actually that film, Noah, the opening 10 minutes is straight out of the Book of Enoch, where it has the fallen angels who turn into the rock monsters and all that sort of thing. That is actually in the Book of Enoch. So someone in Hollywood has read at least a couple of chapters of the book. Now, the key secular events in this period, there are 3 wars. The Great Revolt of 66. Now, remember, Jesus was crucified either maybe 33, 35. So this is a generation later. The Great Revolt, although it's usually portrayed as a revolt, was really an attempt by the Judean political establishment to re-establish their place in the Roman political system. Under King Herod the Great, they had a very favoured place in the Roman political system. They were basically in charge of the whole little sort of Balkan set of tiny little nations. The sad result of the Great Revolt, which was appallingly run. I mean, it was appallingly run. The Great Revolt was actually a civil war in a revolt. It was quashed by the Romans and the temple destroyed. 50 years later, you have the Kittos War, which is a series of disorganized and violent insurgencies. We don't know how they arose. We have very little evidence. We have inscriptional evidence. The causes are unknown, and again, they were quashed by the Romans. The final revolt seems to have been an attempt by a guy called Shimon bar Kosovo to restore the temples. Again, it was quashed by the Romans. Now, I want to take a look at the Jewish timeline of events here.
Before
you can see.
I just wanted to give you a quick update that you're about 20 minutes in. So I just wanted to let you know.
No, the end already.
I just wanted to give you a warning. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Jewish history in this period can be divided into three periods. There's the Second Temple period. After the Great Revolt, when the city of Jerusalem is destroyed, a group of intellectuals and very smart people moved to a little town called Yavne to continue work on what will become the Great Law Code of the Jews. After Bar Kokhba's revolt, the entire province of Judea is destroyed, and the rabbinic movement has to move to Galilee to save itself. Now, let's take a look at the timeline of the New Testament. Here are the ranges of dates that we think that the books of the New Testament were written. Excuse me. No, sorry about that. The letters of Paul are the earliest documents we have. The Gospels of Mark and Matthew were written after the Great Revolt. And we think the latest book in the New Testament is Second Peter. So this is the time span we're looking at. All the books are written by the year 150. Now, Judaism after the temple. Jewish long-form literature disappears. We don't know why. And they create a book called the Mishnah, and it appears from absolutely nowhere. It doesn't resemble anything from the Old Testament, anything from the apocalyptic literature. So we have no long-form literature, but we do have plenty of inscriptions and archaeological evidence. Now, the Kittos War didn't help the Jewish cause much. Bar Kokhba's revolt was an absolute catastrophe. The entire region of Judea was depopulated. The founding rabbis of the rabbinic movement were martyred. It was. Now, here's an example of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the first great creation of the rabbinic movement. This is actually a page from the Talmud. Now, I don't know Hebrew, so I don't know exactly what it says. The Mishnah is only ever read as part of the Talmud. The Mishnah it's a fairly dry book, shall we say. And it's a combination, law code, law digest, collection of anecdotes. And here in this page from the Talmud, the pink section is a section from the Mishnah. A yellow section is an initial commentary, a very ancient commentary. And then you have other commentaries on it. The Mishnah would turn out to be Judaism's survival manual. How do we survive when our entire homeland has been annihilated and the center of our life, the temple, has gone? Now, Judaism is hard to explain its origins because, as I said, the Mishnah comes from nowhere. Christianity is easy to explain. Christianity is the only apocalyptic group to survive the fall of the temple. Now, Christianity has many things in common with lots of other apocalyptic sects. Axis of light, dark, good, evil. There will be a master figure descended from David who will do some good things for the Judeans. But the end of time is imminent. But when time ends, God will establish his heavenly rule, and importantly, everyone will survive after death. There will be a general resurrection of the dead. Now, Christianity differed from all the other apocalyptic groups by saying, first, Jesus is a divine entity. The other groups didn't say that a divine entity was coming. They were saying that, yes, a Messiah, but the Messiah is going to be a man, perfectly normal man, and he'll be a descendant of the house of David. He'll be a warrior king, and maybe there'll be two Messiahs. There'll be a priest as well. Now, Jesus also did not free Israel from Roman oppression. For the other groups, the whole point of the Messiah was to free Judea from Roman oppression. The other weird thing about Christianity was that it insisted that the end of times had begun when Jesus was resurrected. The other groups said, no. Everyone is going to be resurrected all at once. What's this thing about just one guy getting first? So that was weird. And also the emphasis that Jews and Gentiles alike can partake in God's heavenly rule. None of the other groups believe that. This is strictly for Judeans who wanted to be free of Rome. In the Second Temple, the disciples die, the charismatic preachers such as Paul fade away, and the Christians write fan fiction gospels. After Bar Kokhba's revolt, we see the beginning of the imperial church in corporate. It becomes literally a franchise system, bishops running each franchise. Disappointingly, women's roles in the franchise are denigrated. The Apostle Paul emphasizes women's roles. After this, it becomes really a patriarchal system of clubs. And finally, this is one of the free downloadable charts you can get from my website. Okay, let's move on. I finished talking.
Perfect. Well, we have some questions. So
Okay.
The first question comes from Raven, and who asks, why is the area of Judea so contested even back then? Because it doesn't seem like they have a whole lot of natural resources.
It was contested because it was in the way.
Oh,
Simple as that. It was the land route between the powerful Egyptians to the south and the powerful Syrians to the north. You had to, there wasn't that much in Judea, which is why it was always run by really bad Romans. But it was the highway. So you had armies marching backwards and forwards, unfortunately.
oh, that's interesting. And Cecil asks, why Bar Kokhba instead of Bar Kokhba?
Bar Kokhba,
Yes.
he was traditionally known as Bar Kokhba, but in the past 50 years, we discovered some of his letters. Oh, that's a great literary find. Some of the letters from the guy. And it turns out his real name is Kokhba. And interestingly enough, most of his letters are written in Greek. Now that says something about him.
So just for me, so it says like he was Greek originally, or was he educated?
Oh, no. He was 150% Jewish. He was out to liberate Judea from the Romans. But Greek was such a common language that in order to communicate with some of his lieutenants, he had to write in Greek.
Oh, that's interesting. That is interesting. Linda asks, is the Western Wall all that remains of the Second Temple?
I honestly don't know. They keep digging up little bits every so often. That's the main bit.
Yeah.
I haven't been to Jerusalem, so I don't know.
Fascinating. This is really interesting. Let's see. I had a question that I'm blanking on right now, but well, going back to the beginning of your presentation, is there a reason, like when were those books sort of purged from the King James Bible? And is there a reason that Revelation got to stay while the others got kicked out?
Okay, I'll start with Revelation. Well, firstly, the Protestant canon is defined by Martin Luther.
Right.
Okay, he is the man. Now, he wanted to kick out Revelation, but Martin Luther's successors said, no, okay, the guy who wrote this book was obviously tripping, but let's keep it in. So it just stayed in. It wasn't really a purposeful act. It was more like a committee decision, and it just happened. And all of those books of the Apocrypha, as they're called, which is simply a name for the books that the Catholics have, it's just Martin Luther said, no, I'm not buying them. I'm not buying them. But they, as I said, they stayed in Bibles, King James Bibles, to the 19th century.
Oh.
And it is believed that the only reason that they left in the 19th century is because people producing, say, the Gideon Bible didn't want to have to spend paper putting those books in.
Oh, that's interesting. So funny. Let's see. Linda asks, can you go over the connection between the apocalyptic Jewish literature and the New Testament?
Well, the whole thing is apocalyptic. I mean, if you just look at, say, the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus is depicted, where Mark has a section called the Little Apocalypse, literally the Little Apocalypse, and it runs towards the end of the book. It runs for a chapter or two, and it talks about the end of days. The world is about to end. Only the righteous will survive. God is coming for everyone. So that's a chunk of the Jewish apocalyptic literature right at the very heart of Christianity. And it's what Christianity is all about. Christianity has always predicted that the end is imminent. It's just hasn't quite arrived yet for some reason. I mean, Christianity is an apocalyptic group.
And Raven asks, did the Ethiopian Orthodox Church have a similar purge of books of their Bible? Is theirs the longest?
The Ethiopians seem to have had the opposite approach. They hoovered up every book they could find.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and we don't know how or why it happened. I mean, we don't know how the canon of the New Testament came to be formed.
Right.
There was no one guy who said, "Oh yeah, here it is." The Romans didn't decide it. It's just all these things are lost to time.
Yeah. That's in. Yeah. So so was there any conflict from between the Catholics and the Ethiopians in terms of what books they tended to accept? If the Ethiopians were really just accepting everything and the Catholics were sort of a middle ground?
Well, Ethiopian Christianity was only really rediscovered in the 19th century. Because Ethiopia had been cut off from Christendom by the Arab/Muslim world for a very long time.
Oh.
And explorers only managed to get down to Ethiopia actually in the very late 1700s. There was one Scottish explorer who was mad as a fruitcake, who around about the time of the American War of Independence decided to go exploring. And he is the guy who brought back the Book of Enoch. And the Book of Enoch, when it reached Europe, they said, "What language is this for a start?" When they found out ways to translate it, they then said, "Yeah," and forgot about it for basically the entire 19th century until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and it was demonstrated that the Book of Enoch was actually ancient and not just a crazy thing.
Huh. And so the Book of Enoch, though, it's not in is it in the Torah and the Old Testament at all? Or it was just sort of really lost and then sort of rediscovered?
It was lost and rediscovered. Enoch is in fact mentioned in the New Testament in the letter of Jude.
Okay.
And there is a quote from the Book of Enoch in the letter of Jude, although we didn't know it was a quote until the 19th century.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's funny. All right. Last call for questions. All right. Well, this was really, really interesting. Thank you so much for doing this and for getting up so early. And yeah,
the getting up early wasn't fun, but no, it was a pleasure, and I hope you guys enjoyed it.
I really did, and I see a lot of people in the chat did too. So
okay, great.
Thank you, and thank you guys for coming. And yeah, I will see you later. All right. Bye.
Toodles.
Toodles.